How about that?
Oh, yes. I can see John.
Okay, that's great. Now I know. Okay, we're good. Okay, so yeah, so that's good. We're gonna wait a couple more minutes. Looks like people are still joining in.
Oh, and that's just fine. There's no time constraints here, so I would rather start a few minutes late than have anybody miss out. So my name is John Mussel, and I have several hats. I am a beekeeper. I am a bumblebee conservationist. I'm the president of the Red River Apiarist Association, which is an organization that is education based for training beekeepers and the public on the importance of pollinators and how to keep bees properly. And I do talks and demonstrations for schools and for associations like ours about the importance of pollinators and why they affect us, or their absence can affect us, and how we can all help encourage the environment for them to thrive. So without further ado, I'll start. A lot of people have heard that bees are in trouble, and that's been kind of going on for a long time. Like, we need to save the bees, we need to help the bees. And that's partially true and a little bit inaccurate now. Domesticated honeybees, the ones that commercial apiarists have, the population over the last 3 years has actually grown in, say, where, because we have all this attention and because there is human stewardship directly over them, they have the best chances of survival because of we're able to intervene to help medicate, help treat, and keep them from crashing. What is quite overlooked is the fact that in North America, there's over 4,000 species of bees. And you can see where I've put up this poster of all the different varieties. And you'll even see varieties that look like houseflies, or they look like wasps. And you may not think those are beneficial, but they most certainly are. There has been a decline in the last 3 decades of almost 40 to 50% of all insect life, including this group of beneficial pollinators or subgroup of beneficial pollinators globally. Now, I want you to just stop and think about that number for a second. 40 to 50% of all insects, there's been a decrease of their population that much. If any of you remember going on family road trips, where you'd load up into the car and you'd drive out to the beach or the cabin or to your aunt's, and in the summer afterwards, the front of the car would just be spattered with dead bugs, right? That doesn't happen anymore. There used to be things like bug shields and bug screens that you would put over your car's hood and radiator to keep it from overheating, because it could get clogged up because you'd be driving through clouds of insects. That doesn't happen anymore. And that's really unsettling, because there are people that aren't fond of insects and are glad that they can go out at night or sit on the deck and not be bothered. But they hold a huge, huge anchor in our food chain, because there's so many species of fish and wildlife and birds that consume these insects, to survive. It's a huge, huge food source. So one's got to ask, like, what's going on here? Because it's not just pollinators, it's insects in general. Like, what's changing, or what are we doing, or what's going on where there is such this dearth? Well, there's a few things. The I guess one of the big bad guys would be climate change. Now, the climate is changing. As being a farmer, I mean, I'm not going to turn around and join or even entertain the debate about global warming and is it man-made or is it a natural cycle or whatever. It's sort of irrelevant in this particular circumstance because in truth, the climate is changing. And if the climate's changing, change doesn't necessarily mean always a bad thing, but it does put stress on the environments and it does put stressors on species. And then with insects, for instance, when you've got different levels of precipitation or colder springs or hotter summers, that'll benefit some species and it will be detrimental to others. So that is one considerable reason. The other one is the reduction of environmental diversity. And part of that is the fact that there are more and more and more like humans are taking up more and more land than ever before. We have we are draining wetlands and we are expanding our cities, and instead of having prairie or tall grass or shrubs or small forests or anything, we are replacing it with houses and concrete and driveways. And even though we'll build parks, a lot of this is lawn, just lawn. And lawns are funny things. Lawns have a history throughout, even to the Middle Ages, of sort of flaunting wealth. And maybe that's why they're so popular. Because if you had an abundance of land and you didn't have to cultivate it and you could just turn it into nice, lush lawn, it was basically showing to your community that I have such excess wealth, look how important I am, look how rich I am, look how successful I am. And it seems to have trickled down where people really sort of covet these long roll, these green areas, which are just grass and nothing else. And it looks pretty, but when you think about it, it's pretty much barren when it comes to being any advantage or providing any kind of a food source for the insect world in itself. So the other reason why of the insect decline and the stress on pollinators is also agriculture. We used to go from sort of farming like this style, where you would have multiple crops in a hectare, smaller plots, a lot of mixed farming. Even if you had a seed farmer, it would be mixed. And we've sort of gone to this kind of farming, monoculture farming. And the problem with monoculture farming is that any organism that is on the face of the planet, if they're eating just one thing, they are not getting a balance of nutrients. And insects are the same way. Even insects that like like flowering plants or this field of canola that you're seeing here is very beneficial to pollinators. It would be the equivalent if I took you and fed you nothing but carrots for 2 weeks. And then the next 2-week session, you ate nothing but chicken. And then for 2 weeks, you ate nothing but potatoes. And in truth, all of these different foods aren't bad for you, but you're not getting what your body needs, as in for variety. So this will compromise immune systems and make insects weaker, and thus make them susceptible to diseases and viruses. And yes, insects do get diseases and viruses. The other reason for the decline of insects is, of course, pesticides. And some pesticides that have been developed these days are a family of neonicotine-based pesticides, neonicotinoids. They were touted as being the green pesticides, the ones that wouldn't hurt nature because they were actually, as the name suggests, nicotine-based. However, these are systemic pesticides. So once they're applied, they actually go through the root system and are in the plant entirely. And they don't really go away. They take an incredibly long time to break down. So if they're applied year after year after year, you have to think about it as applying a coat of paint year after year after year. And these pesticides end up being in the groundwater, and they end up actually going into other plants that drink that groundwater and into sloughs and creeks and waterways, and they start affecting, well, all life forms all the way through. So between these combinations of monoculture agriculture, pesticides, human beings taking all of the available environment to build housing and keeping it nice and sterile and spraying for mosquitoes, insects have been really under siege in a way. And, you know, with those insects are the pollinators that we all depend on. Pollinators literally affect 70% of our food supply that's grown. So fruits and nuts and vegetables, legumes and certain grains, 70% of those yields are highly dependent on the presence of pollinators, not just honeybees, all bees. And not just the bee family, but there are also moths, wasps, flies, butterflies, hummingbirds, and bats. And all of these have a crucial role in the food chain because flowers and plants have also evolved side by side with all of these species. And certain species depend on certain species of insects or birds to pollinate them exclusively, because that's why you'll see flowers with long trumpet shapes, or you'll have alfalfa, for instance. Although honeybees will pollinate alfalfa, cutter bees are evolved to specifically deal with this little spring leaf that's in alfalfa that will swat other insects away. So when we affect one species of pollinators, we can't step back and go, well, okay, that's okay. This one species of bee or pollinating fly is now extinct, but there's so many more others. There's four so like thousands that can take its place, and that's not the case. It's really important that they're all sort of protected under the same umbrella. And it can be very discouraging because when you take a look at these huge causes, such as, you know, monocultural agricultural practices where farmers are growing nothing but like one crop as far as the eye can see, or you see, you know, the human population exploding and taking up all the available land, and less is left for wildlife. Or you see all of these brand new housing subdivisions that pop up, and you take a look at they're massive houses and they're postage stamp lawns. They're built in a way to maximize the amount of residences per acre, so that more money can be made by building those neighborhoods. The city loves it because that means more taxes per street. And so when you're comparing that against the cost of roadways and services, it's more economically beneficial, so they like that. And it's almost like we've gotten so busy with our lives where we want our $400,000 house, so we're all going to work 2 jobs to get it. We're never going to be home, so we don't want to do any yard work and we don't want to do any gardening. And this is the new norm. And as for you and I that live in a neighborhood that is full of old growth trees and parkways and green space, you look at this and this is the trend, and we feel like there's, well, what can I do about it? And in truth, the COVID-19 sort of the sequestering that a lot of us has had to go through has been this renaissance of where suddenly a lot of people have found that they've got some time on their hands, and things like baking at home has become a fashion. You can kind of tell because there's no flour to be had. But as well, gardening, now that the weather has turned, like people are going to start looking around saying, well, I have some time now. And even though they may have no experience, they're sort of kind of anxious for all the garden centers to open up so they can go buy bedding plants, or maybe we'll do this or change this. And that's kind of great. But what the magic here is, it provides an opportunity for each and every one of us that has access to a garden or owns a piece of property to join in this grassroots movement of planting, selecting plants that are very beneficial to pollinators. And so I'd like to talk about how you and anyone else can plant a small pollinator-friendly garden. And although you don't have to make a huge construct, a lot of it is choosing one plant over another, or where you've traditionally put in certain flowering plants that you found very aesthetically pretty. By choosing a couple of different other species to put in its stead or to intermingle with what you regularly do, you can suddenly turn your front lawn or your front yard or your back garden into a little oasis. And the more per acre of pollinator friendly plants that get put in, basically it's, if you build it, they will come. Because the key to change or to create a microenvironment, or to make changes so that a positive change of environment exists, is just little by little and consistent changes will draw the life forms that feed off of what you're planting, and because they're trying to survive as well. So if you grow it, they will come. So let's say you want to start, you take a look at your property, you take a look at your backyard, and you take a look at your front yard, and you say, well, how can I make my little corner of the universe more friendly for pollinators? How can I help them and support them, and also without, breaking the bank, or we're not talking about completely raising and re-landscaping your yards. We're just talking about making little changes. The first step will always be water. The word oasis is often generalized, but its true meaning stands out when you put it in a desert context, because water is life in the desert. And even in a neighborhood where you've got a river half a mile down the road, water is incredibly important for everything that may come through your backyard, every insect and birds and so forth. So keeping a constant supply of water on hand for insects to utilize is the first step in supporting pollinators in your neighborhood. Now, there's a way to go about it that, for instance, just having, like you'll see people will set up a bird bath, for instance. And then there's sort of the controversy, well, if you have standing water or if you have water barrels, you're sort of creating a breeding ground for mosquitoes. Well, okay, but the key when you're trying to provide water for the nature that's in our neighborhoods is, one is it has to be fresh. If it's moving, it's even better. That will agitate the surface, which will keep mosquitoes and other subsurface laying insects away. But it also needs to be constant. So now we're not talking like you have to actually build a pond in your backyard, but there are plans all over the internet for insect feeders or bee watering. Right here. This is a bee watering station. And what you've got here is marbles. And this can be small river stones or just small rocks. And the tub is filled full of clean water. And what it does is it provides something for insects like bees to anchor on so that they don't, you're not turning it into a drowning pool. Setting out a pan of water without any kind of supports for them to crawl over basically is just going to get them killed because they're not very smart about it. So setting up something like this, or setting up a bird bath and then putting little bits of floating wood or little stones in it will be incredibly beneficial. Bees, for instance, all species of bees collect as much water as they collect nectar from flowers. They do this because water is very important to help regulate the temperature of their colony. And you think about it, they're working outside all day collecting all of this nectar, and they need water to keep hydrated as well, because the nectar that they take isn't something that they're actually drinking. It's sort of like they're just holding it so that they can bring it back to their colony. As well, if you are artistic, here are a couple of ideas that you can also put out on your balcony or on your deck, where these are just little styles of ponds, which is just a container with a small little pump that just circulates the water. Whether you dress it up with bedding plants around it, or if you've got a penchant for water lilies or water-based plants, you can kind of take care of two birds with one stone here by providing something little aesthetic and beautiful in your backyard, but also providing a water source for birds and for insects as well. The chief idea here is consistency. Turning around and putting out a bee or an insect watering station, or creating one of these little tiny ponds and then not filling it and maintaining it every couple of days. The water has to be there, but it has to be there all the time, because insects can smell and they will mark with pheromones and know where these watering places are. For them to keep visiting your yard on a regular basis, it has to be there, not just filling it up once a month, but actually paying attention to it. And over time, when a species knows that there's an ample food supply and an ample watering supply, it creates another piece of the environment, which causes, gives them that sense of security where they can start thinking about propagating. So for insects like butterflies or solitary bees or mason bees, water is a really key thing. I want to talk a little bit about lawns. We did before, but this is kind of important. When you have a lawn like this, yes, it's pretty, it's gorgeous. It's also kind of zero maintenance. Like you take a look at these houses that they're building in new neighborhoods, and all of these trees are basically shade bearing, but they're usually not fruit trees, because fruit trees are messy and time consuming, and they attract wasps in the fall. They'll have decorative grasses instead of flowers, because those are sort of, you plant them, they're perennials, and they come back. Sorry, they come back every year, and then you really don't have to deal with them. And then you've got these acres and acres of, or meters and meters of nothing but lawn, and there's nothing but grass here. And unless you're a goat, it doesn't really provide any kind of a value to the local environment that we all live in. And one thing to consider is, if you don't have time, or if this is your lawn and you still like your lawn and you want to keep it that way, well, there is an option. And instead of just seeding lawn or grass, you can consider doing clover. And not all of it like you see in this picture here, but you can start adding clover seed to your current existent lawn just to break up. And it's incredibly beneficial to that lawn too. Clover is a nitrogen fixer. So basically it self-fertilizes your lawn. The nodules also help loosen the soil. And all of these flowers are major nectar source. Food sources for butterflies, food sources for moths, food sources for bees of all species. And you can still keep this flower component by maybe not mowing your lawn down to a golf green, pristine kind of level. I see it all the time where people will mow their lawns very short, and they do it for a number of reasons. One is they think it looks better. Two, they think it's effective weed control. And three is, if I do it really short, then I don't have to do it every week, right? Well, it's misleading, because grass grows at its own rate, and that's what determines how often we have to cut it. But in all due honesty, if you keep your lawn long, you can still, run the lawnmower over it, but still keep it raised and the grass at about 1.5 inches. You will still have plenty of clover and other flowering nodes pop up and still bloom with your grass. It breaks up the green. It looks amazing. It helps fertilize, and it feeds the insect population in your neighborhood. We keep our grass fairly long at my house, probably about 1.5 to 2 inches. And we find, well, I'm not big on watering lawns to begin with, but our lawn retains all that morning dew. It doesn't burn off as quick. And so your lawn actually is more lush naturally, just because you're not trying to keep it like a golf green. And remember, golf courses, they mow all the time, but they also water all the time. And it's a huge waste of resources. So for your lawn, consider this. Consider something a little bit different. And while we're talking about weeds, I want to touch base on dandelions, because dandelions are an amazing early spring nectar source and pollen source provider for insects of all varieties. And we turn around and we treat them like public enemy number one. And so this year, when those dandelions start popping up, do nature a favor. Let them go through their yellow stage, let them bloom. And when they start to wither and close up, then uproot them. And don't use sprays. Don't use herbicides. Herbicides kill a lot more than just weeds. They poison the soil underneath, the microbes in the soil, small insects in the soil. There's a reason why they don't put "do not drink" on a herbicide container. If you are going to be weeding your property, weed by hand. If you've got weeds coming up through your patio, I would suggest going and picking up a weed torch and burning them off instead of spraying Roundup. Because Roundup and glyphosate is just killer on the environment. And if you leave the dandelions just to sort of provide a food source and then whisk them away instead of just taking them out as soon as you see them, you're going to be doing your neighborhood insect population a huge boon. But what about gardens? Well, what you plant matters, and what you plant matters a lot. You have to take a look at, most people will plant their garden and they're kind of basing it on aesthetics. They're looking at if they're planting a vegetable garden, they're planting because it's practical and they're raising food. If they're planting gardens like flower beds, then they're usually doing on what looks nice or what they're familiar with growing. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's beneficial to pollinators, and it also doesn't mean you have to scrap whatever you've been doing in the past 10 years and suddenly focus strictly on these groups of plants that I'll be showing you. But if you do a little bit, if you have a little section in your yard where you're planting just for pollinators, it really makes a difference. Because if we get 20% of a block doing that in a neighborhood, then suddenly you've got these little oases every third or every fourth house that has a food supply and then maybe has a watering supply. And it makes a massive difference on them being able to finish out their life cycle, for them to propagate, and for them to maintain their populations. Because if they're struggling in the future, if they're struggling outside of the city, our actual city living spaces become sort of havens for a lot of these insects, for them to spread outwards back into the country if they're having trouble surviving out there due to pesticides. So the first list of plants that I'm going to share with you, I'm really hoping that that's shared. Hold on. Okay, so I have a list up here of plants that attract pollinators. And we're not going to be going through this list in detail, of course, but one more time, I'm sorry. But I have these lists and several others that I can email to you afterwards if you like. All of these, or most of these plants, and we're just going to scroll down slowly. A lot of these plants are available at in seed or from local gardening centers. All of these plants will grow in this zone. Particular attention to Northwest native plants that grow very, very well here and are also very suited for the pollinating species that we have in the areas. And what I've got here is pollinator flower preferences. And I have there's the list of pollinators from bees to butterflies. And this list will tell you what flowers that they sort of have a preference. So if you're a big fan of bees, you know, there are flowers that you can specifically plant that'll attract just them. But if you're looking for, let's say, you want to be attracting hummingbirds, or you want to be attracting butterflies, there are other plants that you can specifically make plentiful in your yard. And again, if you plant it, they will come. We don't have a lot of bats, especially bats that are pollinators in Manitoba, but it is, they are around, and there are some bat houses, and I know there's a couple even in our area. And it's one of those things where, like for instance, hummingbird feeders or mason bee houses or bat boxes may not really, you may not see them become used or populated for season after season after season. But if you make it a permanent fixture, eventually they will be found, and eventually they will be used. I know when they were hanging up bat boxes in the Assiniboine forest, it took 7 years for them to actually fill. But once they did and they established, they're full to this day. Okay, I just want to take a little bit of a break and maybe open up for a few questions. I've kind of covered a smattering of things, and because it's such a broad topic, but I'd definitely like to hear some feedback on some specifics that I could entertain.
So there is a raise your hand feature. If you move your mouse, it should be on the bottom of the screen. Otherwise, it should be in your menu. And if you raise your hand, then we can unmute you. Oh, there you go, Melanie. There you go, Mel.
Melanie, do you have a question?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. I was just wondering, John, when you were talking about the bee baths with the marbles and stuff, how often should we be replacing the water in that? And like sometimes I find the ones that I've made, which are basically just shallow dishes filled with marbles, like the one that you showed, nothing creative, they get kind of scummy, right? Because leaves fall in them and bees drown and stuff like that. And they just get kind of gunked up. Like, so how do you keep them clean? How often should I be cleaning the water? What would you recommend?
If you have a really warm day, there are times where you almost have to top them up every day. What I've generally done in the past is I would take a pitcher of water or out of the rain barrel, and I would just pour it all over so that it would sort of overflow the dish, and it would sort of rinse it away. The strange thing about bees is that they have a strange affection for scummy water, and they also really like pool water, chlorinated water, and we haven't really figured out why they do that. But if you can just keep them topped up, because if you've got maybe a cup and a half of water or 4 cups of water in a bee watering station, and it's 30 degrees out in August, that's not going to last very long. So something like that, you may have to pay attention to it almost on a daily basis, like when you come back from work or first thing in the morning. I try to keep it easy by keeping water barrels like underneath my drain spouts, and we'll use that water first, and we'll top up any feeders we have in our yard. I actually put a pond in my backyard. And I didn't do it for any greater reasons than I just wanted a pond in my backyard. But I saw the huge difference in insect traffic, and then because birds feed on insects, bird traffic. And, you would have squirrels or chipmunks come to drink. You would have, suddenly my deck had 2 or 3 cats on it lounging and sunning in the sun. If you put in a permanent water source, they will come. So if it really just shows that there's the need for it. So as much as it can be a little bit like, the smaller of a watering station you have, the more attention that you're going to have to put into it, because it'll need constant replenishing. But if you go online, there is so many different styles. There's bucket varieties that autofill just through gravity. There's ones that you can set up that will last you a good week as well. So you can take a look at online and just put in bee watering station into Google, and you'll see quite a few plans come up.
Can I ask a follow-up?
You sure can.
Should we be putting the bee watering stations in the same place every day so that they get used to that? Or does it matter?
It would be a good idea. Find a place that suits your, like, you can move them around a little bit, but in the end, bees especially, will remember and communicate the location of a water source or a nectar source or a pollen source to the rest of their colony or group. And you can guarantee that if you are the consistent, if you're consistently maintaining that water source, they will consistently visit it. If you move it 10 feet, they're not going to get completely lost, but they will rediscover it. But if you're kind of bumping it all over your yard, it does make it a little bit less efficient. But I mean, it's the lesser of the two evils. If it's there and they can find it, it's better than not being there at all.
Great. Okay, so we got a couple questions typed in, and we've also got a couple hand raisings. So we'll go back and forth. We'll do one of the typed in questions, and then we'll go to Tyler, and then we'll do another typed question, then we'll go to Cheryl. So the first typed question came from JP. Says, how would I add clover seed to an existing lawn?
Really, really easy. If after you do your spring cleanup and after you rake your lawn fairly vigorously, if you have a dethatcher, that's even better, because you kind of clean up some of the dead undergrowth. You can buy clover seed at a lot of garden centers. You can buy it at some of the larger hardware like Home Depot, places like that. You can get it online. And clover grows very easy, and you can basically hand seed it by just scattering it over your existing lawn, preferably just before a rain, and just let nature take its course. It's really prolific on its own, and it provides your lawn with, it's a nitrogen fixer, so it provides your lawn with natural fertilizer. So it kind of eliminates you a step down the road if you're one for using that. Also, a quick note on lawn care services, because around this time of the year, you'll see the flyers in our mailboxes saying, oh, get a weed-free lawn. Oh, get a great green lawn. Those guys use chemicals in a heavy way for fertilizing, and the herbicides that they use are quite strong. They maximize their profits by doing less trips, not more. So they do have a habit, some companies worse than others, of overspraying. And for the money that they're charging you and the collateral damage that they're doing, I'd seriously reconsider using those services if that's part of your annual yard plan. It's much easier to turn around and seed a little bit of clover, and all of the fertilizer that they're dumping onto your property is not that beneficial. They sort of hype it up a bit more than it really is. The next question.
Next question we had Tyler. So if you just unmute yourself there, Tyler, you'll be able to ask a question.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for taking us right from the beginning. the way you took us through. That was really, really helpful. So one of my questions is about the clover. So is it just as beneficial to pollinators to have the clover in the front yard as opposed to a garden?
It's beneficial for them to have something, anything, because think of them as starving. If there is, if you have set gardens, if you don't want to make any changes in that regard, or if you don't have the time, or if you don't have the room, this is an easy way for you to sort of throw your offering into the pollinator pot, so to speak. Not a lot of, it's not very costly, and any nectar or pollen producing bloom is better than none. You'll also see that with all of our elm trees that we're losing, the city has a list of replacement species that you can sometimes request. It's an opportunity right there to request a tree that produces flowers and produces pollen, like basswood or linden is on that list, and Manitoba maple is on that list. So if you are losing one of our beautiful elm trees, and if you're proactive in getting your name on that list, and you can just phone 311 and they'll direct you to the website where you can do that, you've got an opportunity there to provide a nectar and pollen source for a couple of weeks out of the year for our local pollinators.
I've got one more question. Do you have any suggestions for shade, like shade plants that would be like sort of in the front yard? I'm on the north side.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on the south side, so my front yard faces north.
I do. I actually have a list of them, which I can't seem to pull up here, but my email, I'm going to give out my email, and I can email anyone that's interested all of these lists for their planting selections for this year. Along the side of my house, we had this strip where it was just dirt. Nothing really kind of grew there. It was all heavy shade. We put in lupins and hostas. And although those aren't huge bloomers, it again is better than absolutely nothing, because any plant is a good plant. This is what it looks like, where we're basically we're really fighting to get anything to grow here for whatever reason. But lupins and other varieties that bloom a little bit are still better than absolutely nothing. As well, let me see if I can pull something up. For our front yard, and I'll be completely honest with this. I wasn't necessarily a huge fan when my better half brought this to my attention, but she ended up redoing the front beds of our lawn, and you can see bee balm and echinacea and a handful of species that, of course, I'm not going to give you an accurate name for, but it really drew in the attention. And I did have a bed here, but not having a lot of skill originally, I would just plant no-brainers like marigolds, tons and tons of marigolds, because those you can sort of plant in and forget. And she really brought this up to life. She then said, well, can we start putting some beds on the front lawn and break up this grass, because this doesn't really do anything for anybody. And I was really reluctant until, I gave in, and she did this. And to my absolute joy, it looked just marvelous. She put in 2 circular stone gardens, and she's planting all sorts of bee-friendly and pollinator-friendly flowers. And it's just basically taking space that was just growing grass and repurposing it to something else. And if you don't want, and if you really think that that's just going to be way too much work for you, you can invest in, instead of putting in plants that only grow for one season, you put in plants that come back year after year, and then you can sort of build on it as well. I'll also note leaving some open space, some open soil is really important, like between your plants, like not packing everything in tight. There's about 600 species of bees in North America that are actually soil bees. They burrow, and not just bumblebees, small other garden bees, and they're prolific pollinators. And so keeping some open soil is also really important as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Tyler. So we got a typed question from the chat, then we'll go to Cheryl, and then we've got a Q&A question. So Joanne asked, I've seen a variety of bee houses on the market. Are there things to look for or to avoid?
Yeah, I've actually seen these. I'm sorry, I'm getting a warning that my internet connection is unstable, which is impossible, but yeah. I've seen a couple. One of the better ones that I saw on for mason bees was at Costco. Costco had it looks like these little bamboo, you may have seen it. It's a little bamboo house with little tiny bamboo or tubes in it. And this sort of environment, this sort of structure is really, really good for mason bees. Mason bees are a stingless bee that sort of looks like sort of like a blue fly, but they are great pollinators. And you can again go online and you can see tons of plants where you can make them yourselves, but I have seen those that people have bought, the little bamboo ones, and I've seen them actually be very, very successful. Now, nature adapts. It's very infrequent that you will put together a bee house or a bat house and it'll be rejected because you used the wrong style. A lot of it is more so of where it is placed. For instance, the best mason bee house on the planet isn't going to do much good unless there is a source of water and a source of mud. It also has to be hung 10 feet up off the ground, and it has to be facing south. And if you have all of that criteria, those mason bees will set up shop. It may take a season or two for them to establish a colony, but if all those factors are there, that's the perfect environment for them to propagate. If you don't want to wait, you can actually buy mason bee cocoons from a small little company in Edmonton, Alberta. In the spring, they'll mail you a box of mason bee cocoons. And so then you take the house that you've made, or you take the house that you bought, and you seed the cocoons into the holes. And when they hatch, they have this, that they'll mark it with a pheromone, and that will be the home that they will live out their life cycle in, including filling it up with new cocoons over the course of the summer. So there is, I'm sure there's some poorly made ones out on the market, but I've seen mason bees and I've seen cutter bees set up their homes behind old vinyl siding. So I think it's less on the aesthetics and more on the environment that sheltered place is set up in. What I have up on the screen here is a sheet. If you're looking for hummingbirds to set up a little bit of a mini ecosystem for hummingbirds, listed below there are the plants that they really prefer. And all of these are more tubular flowers with certain colors that are very attractive to them. Again, if you grow it, they will come. If you really want them to come, hummingbird feeders will also be very, very appreciated by them. In the city, it can take time for them to discover these food sources. So you have to be patient and you have to be diligent and maybe throwing away some of the old feed in the feeders and putting in fresh, even though you're not seeing any traffic. But the secret for creating an environment that these life forms are going to thrive in is you being consistent. And because we are close to the river and some forested area, there are hummingbirds in our neighborhood. You just have to set up the shop and be patient for them to come visit you. And again, I can email any of this material to anyone that's interested. Just written in chat here, hostas and bleeding hearts do very well in the shade. Bleeding hearts are neat too. It's a very nice plant. And yeah, you're right. They do very, very well in the shade.
Okay, Cheryl, if you unmute yourself, you should be able to talk to us now.
My boulevard, John, is salt and dirt and a few weeds. Is it possible that clover would grow if I did some extra soil, or what would you suggest? Because I think that would be a great idea for my boulevard.
Salt. When I bought my house on Noble, there was huge issues with the past owners on ice dams on the roof. And their way of combating that was by taking tons of salt along the side walkway. And there was a little strip of grass, or dirt really, between my house and my neighbors that nothing would grow. It was just dusty, horrible soil. And you could seed it and water it all summer long and it won't grow. And in your particular area with your boulevard, especially if it's salt ridden, it won't grow either.
Okay.
Well, how I got around that is there's soil conditioners, and it's basically, they're just enzymes that will break down the salt. I'm not sure, because it was so many years ago when I bought my stuff. I think I spent about $35, and it was just a one treatment. And I sprayed this stuff on this patch of land, and it took about 3 years for all the salt to break down. And of course you have to stop using it winter after winter, but grass started to regrow. And with the application of a little bit of and we're talking just some light scatterings of topsoil and grass seed, we've been able to regrow that. If you've got a dead out area and it's just because of high traffic, and it's just, or it's because of salt, or if it's because of too much sun, it is adaptable. But the first thing would be is to recondition that soil into something where anything can grow at all. Clover is pretty hardy, even in a salty soil situation, but breaking up the surface and throwing down a little bit of topsoil to cover it, little things like that will really start. I don't think there's anything you can take with a patch like that you can just throw in and it'll grow. There's very, very little that it wouldn't be invasive or pretty ugly anyway.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I'm not the one who's putting that on, it's the city, because somehow the way they grate and dump the gravel, and also the salt are landing heavily on the boulevards. So
yeah, especially if you live near a corner lot, I noticed that when the trucks come by, they're scattering sand and salt all over the place, and it becomes pretty problematic. You can also Google salt-resistant plants, and you might find a couple of varieties that may do a little bit better. I think the main thing there is to get some kind of a cover crop just to start
right,
breaking the soil down and then
exactly.
maintaining that. And that's sort of the route that I would go.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're very, very welcome.
So now we've got two text questions, both related to clover. One is, does clover do well in the shade? And the other one, is the clover that grows naturally, is it the same as the clover you would buy at the store?
Well, there's many species of clover. Like what you're looking at when you see all that nice little white lawn clover, that is what you're buying in the store. But you've got to be careful on the variety. You want red clover or Slake clover for your lawn. You don't want sweet clover because although that's a really cool plant, it grows about 2 to 4 feet, and it's the yellow or the white varieties that you see growing on the shoulders of the highways all summer. Bees love that. Pollinators love that. However, it's somewhat unsightly, and it likes to grow. And but if you're buying clover seed from a garden center, that's the seed that you're going to. That's the variety you're going to be finding because they're not going to be selling anything else. Does it do well in the shade? Yes, it will. It will do well in the shade. It's pretty much like that. It can do well in full sun. It does well in dappled lights. It does well in full shade. We had a huge changeover when we lost 2 beautiful elm trees in front of our house, mine and my neighbors, and we went from full shade front lawn to full sun, and now it's kind of dapply. And unfortunately, the way things are going is all of the elm trees in our neighborhood are eventually going to be gone. That's just the way it is. So you can try to plan ahead, and maybe if you've got shade now, don't always count on having shade forever. There might be a bit of a break there.
Okay, so we look like we don't have any other questions, but if there are any other questions, you can either put it in the chat, in the Q&A, or raise your virtual hand and we'll get to the question. I don't know if in the meantime, John has any other juicy tidbits to share.
I'm typing in my email address into chat, and feel free to email me, and in the subject line just put plant lists, and I would do I will email you the material that we were talking about. And quickly, if we have some time, I'm just going to touch base on urban beekeeping. And domesticated honeybees, like actual honeybees, became legal 3-4 years ago when the city of Winnipeg changed its bylaws to allow urban beekeeping. Beekeeping is a very fun and rewarding activity. However, it's not a plug and play activity. So if anyone is interested in playing with bees or looking into urban beekeeping, I do have a step-by-step walkthrough guide on how to go about it, recommended reading and courses that you should take first. There's a really nice short course at the University of Manitoba that's 7 evenings over 3 months, plus some field days, that starts in December. The Red River Apiarist Association is a support group that helps ongoing education for novice beekeepers. And as well, we have seminars and lectures, and we have a practice yard where we have 8 to 10 honeybee colonies. So if anyone's really interested in becoming a beekeeper or would like the experience of going out and playing with some honeybees, in about a month when the bees are more set up and stable, and if you can fit into one of the extra suits that I have, you probably can because I'm kind of fat. I can take you on a little bit of a field trip to go and see how a honeybee colony works, and all the fun that entails.
Okay, cool. Well, I am seeing one question. There you go. Okay, Shauna, go ahead.
Hi, John. I just have a question about that last little bit on bees. Have you ever entertained the idea of having somebody come and help harvest honey? Because that's really sort of where my interest lies in that process.
Well, it's almost like that's like saying I'd like to come help you dig a ditch, because that is yeah, there would be. If you're looking at doing some honey harvesting, not necessarily in my operation, because the company that I own that packages and produces honey, we are more focused on harvesting comb honey, which isn't as glamorous. But I do know many beekeepers that it come harvesting time, they would be open to a little bit of volunteer work. So if you send me an email with your contact information, come July, I'll get in contact with you and see if I can't pair you up with somebody.
Okay, cool. I'll do that.
That's like wanting all the work and none of the fun. But hey, I'm not. It's
Well, I think that would be fun.
Oh, it is. It is. It's just after after this 10,000th frame, it becomes a little bit tedious. You know, it is a wonderful thing to take a look at. I'm just being facetious, but it is part of the hottest and stickiest and exhausting part of the work for sure.
Yeah, I think I like the sticky part.
Was there any topics or any side topics that anyone feels that I need to touch base or touch more on or fill in on? Again, it being such a broad topic, there's so many tangents and side paths I can go down on. So I tried to keep it pretty streamlined. So if anyone wants me to expand on anything, just now's your chance.
Yeah, go ahead, Tyler.
I was wondering, I know that some neighborhoods have petitioned the city for non-pesticide use. Where is Glenelm in that?
How that works is you can register with the city for a buffer zone, and you can't sort of make it inclusive to a neighborhood, but you can, they will, I think it's 100 meters before and after your lot, where if they're coming down with a spraying truck, they will shut the sprayer off 100 meters before and not turn it back on until 100 meters after. Now, something it was really interesting when we were in talks with the city and the city planning council about urban beekeeping and working through some of the kinks. I always had an entrenched opinion that the city loved to spray, malathion here, spray at the drop of a hat there. That's not true. The city hates spraying for mosquitoes. The city knows more than anyone, any entity, that aerial spraying for mosquitoes is a losing battle, and it does very little. It's very much a feel-good appeasement action for some very stiff-necked homeowners and homeowner associations. We live, city of Winnipeg is at the bottom of a river valley. We have swampland wetlands all around the city. Transcona was basically a drained slough, and we've got mosquito breeding all over the place. You could kill every mosquito within the perimeter, and in 4 days in a north wind, you would have that population replenished, regardless of what you sprayed. The city knows this, doesn't want to spray, but kind of feels is in a position where the public taxpayers are demanding it, and so that's why they do it. If you phone up and you're asked for a buffer zone, they're ecstatic. They're clicking their heels, because that means that's less malathion, or it's not malathion anymore. It's the pesticide that they replaced it with. But that's less for them to spray around. It's less labor. They don't have to pay as many crews, and the stuff is expensive. They really, you know, one of the big leverages we had for having them approve the bylaws for urban beekeeping was they could then, every urban beekeeper who registered with the city would automatically be put on that no spray buffer zone. And that made a huge difference. Well, it saved them a fair amount of money.
Thank you. Are dragonflies pollinators?
No, dragonflies are carnivorous in the way where they eat other insects. They eat a lot of wasps. They eat a lot of honeybees. However, they've got a vital link in the food chain, because they in turn are eaten by a lot of vertebrates and birds. So they also eat a ton of mosquitoes. When Taz was the city entomologist, he was trying very hard to have more holistic options when it came to spraying for mosquitoes. And he had a dragonfly breeding program. I remember walking across the Assiniboine footbridge once, and there was literally hundreds of thousands of dragonflies cruising along the surface of the water of the Assiniboine River. It was very forward thinking, and unfortunately, that program seemed to have gotten backburnered when he no longer was the entomologist for the city of Winnipeg. But as much as dragonflies eat other insects and larger insects, they still definitely do have their spot. And eating mosquitoes is one of them. Case in point too is everyone hates wasps, yellow jackets. And they've got good reason to. Unlike honeybees, yellow jackets or common wasps are territorial, and they will sting when you get close to their paper colonies. However, what people don't realize is wasp season doesn't really exist. You know, in the fall, when all of a sudden you start seeing wasps all over the place, they were always there. The difference is a lot of the nectar producing plants have finished their life cycles and are no longer available as a food source. Because of the way the wasps' digestive systems work, is they can go after all sorts of different proteins and sugars and still digest them. That's why you see them congregating around garbage cans, or they're trying to get into your drink when you're sitting on your deck. But the benefit of wasps as well is that they decimate cankerworm populations. Not in the end stage when those cankerworms are black and bristly, but when, you know, they're the green ones that are hanging from the trees for a couple of weeks. Wasps are not pollinators. They have a hard shell instead of a furry body. So they have to get their protein source from other insects, and they really, really like green stage cankerworms.
Thank you so much.
There was a question here. Can I pick up honey from you at home, or where can I find it? Yes, you can. you can email me, and I will. We can make arrangements for sure. I've got my daughter-in-law drops honey off at my house every day from the packaging shop, and would be happy to help you out. Also, a quick note, I'm a bumblebee conservationist. So if bumblebees are nesting on your property and you're finding that you can't live with them because you've got young children or pets, or people are naturally afraid of bumblebees, I relocate them. So please feel free to give me a call or to give me an email. Also, wasp nest removals, I do that too, and I do it without pesticides. So if you're having troubles with wasps for this neighborhood, I'll gladly come down and take them away for you if you need help doing that. Any other questions or anything else?
Okay, well, if that's all the questions, I will thank John for his time. We were very appreciative when he first accepted to do this as a live workshop. We were doubly so when he accepted to adapt and do it live on the internet like this. So thank you, John, very much. You are an asset to the neighborhood, and we're very happy to have you.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much for your patience, you guys, and joining us this evening. And it was a pleasure and an honor talking with you today.